Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kirk here. We're going to be looking at a new unit today. This one is the federal or the national government. We're going to be looking at powers and structures of those guys and girls who are in Washington, D.C. making laws for us. And what does the president do? And how does the Supreme Court work? And all kinds of cool stuff like that. So your question of the day is, what is the structure of the national government as set out in the U.S. Constitution? Before we really get into the bulk of the material, we do want to spend this first couple of days focusing on vocabulary. So let's start. Our first vocabulary definition I'd like to talk about is federalism. Federalism is the power divided between the national and the state government. The national government has certain powers over the states, and then the state governments have certain powers that the federal government doesn't have. There also exist certain powers that both the federal government and state governments have. So when we think about these different, we'll call them levels of government, I want you to think of them as the federal government in Washington, D.C., our state government, Virginia, and then our lowest government would be Danville, the city. Okay? This whole idea is known as federalism. And I want you to remember federalism by this right here. This is called the federalism cake. And the federalism cake shows us the three levels of government in their order. Okay? So if you ever see this picture on the test or a quiz or who knows what, it's federalism. All right? Moving on. Our second definition is separation of powers. Okay? Separation of powers is the division or dividing the government into three separate branches. And that would be legislative, which is Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive branch, which is the president and everything underneath the president, and then finally the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and other federal appeals courts. But that idea of splitting our government up between three powers is called separation of powers. Now, our founding fathers that wrote our Constitution, they thought that if we created only one branch of government, that one branch could become like a king, and that's what they were trying to get away from. So their solution to that was to create three separate branches. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with this slide are the different kinds of legislative powers under the federal government. A lot of these would be specifically for the legislative branch, but they're good to know when we start this unit. The first one is called the expressed or delegated powers. These powers are specifically listed in the U.S. Constitution, and later in the unit, we're going to talk about that a little more. Express powers would be things like the federal government can maintain an armed forces or maintain the armed forces like the Army or something like that. The federal government can operate a post office, or they can pass control federal monies and things like that. These would be powers that were specifically listed in the Constitution for our government to do. Our next one would be implied powers. Now, our implied powers, these are the ones used to carry out express powers, but these are not specifically written in the Constitution. So an implied power would be like the federal government is allowed to raise the price of stamps. So our Constitution says the federal government can create the post office. So the creation of the post office would be an express power, while federal government the federal government raising the price of stamps, that's not in the Constitution, so that would be an implied power. But if you operate the post office, you're going to have to be able to raise the price of stamps to pay for your workers and things like that. Okay? Are there any questions so far? If not, we're going to move on. If so, please just shoot me an email and I'll get back with you. All right. So this little slide right here is showing us different types of federal powers and state powers. So just kind of like showing you the idea of federalism. I don't want to go over this whole diagram right now because we'll do that later. But the powers that are delegated or express powers to the national government would be declare war, create and maintain an armed forces, or that would be the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, later on, because they didn't have planes when they wrote this. The federal government can establish our foreign policy and deal with other countries and other leaders, regulate interstate and foreign trade, like when businesses trade between different states or different nations, like China or something. They make copyright and patent laws. This would be, inventions, movies, music, all that kind of stuff. Establish the post office, and the federal government is allowed to make money. Now, we're not going to talk about the reserve powers. That's these over here. Those are for the states. Or the concurrent powers, these in the middle. These are shared powers that both governments can do, like, for example, raising taxes or building roads. Let's move on. All right, so on this slide, we're going to be looking more specifically at separation of powers. The U.S. Constitution will define the structure and power of the national government. So if I ever ask you what created the American government, your answer is going to be the Constitution. And so the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, those three branches of the national government, are equally distributed. Okay, so each branch has its own set of powers and is independent from the other branches of government. The Constitution defines the powers of each of these three branches, and this became known as separation of powers. Now, I want to show you an example. In the original part, we thought if our government was all in one place, that was a bad idea. Let's not do that. But the better idea was to divide the power between the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, each having their own set of powers and keeping the other one from becoming too powerful, protecting the rights of the citizens, hopefully. This idea of separation of powers is an example of limited government. Okay? They were afraid that our government would get too powerful, and that would cause big problems. Okay? Are there any questions? If not, let's move on. And if so, you can shoot me an email later because this is not in real time. You're just watching a video. All right. Let's erase our marks, and then we're going to move on to our last little bit. The last thing that I really wanted to talk about today is the concept of checks and balances in our government. Now, checks and balances does involve the three branches, but it's a little different than separation of powers, okay? Checks and balances are sort of the idea that each of the three branches will limit the power of the other three branches. So for your definition, you would write a system that gives each of the three branches of government a way to limit the power of the other two. And that's it. But I wanted to give you some key words. So if you see these words on the test, you'll know what branch they're talking about. We'll get more in detail to this later. Key words for the legislative branch would include override, like overriding a president, approving and confirming. They do that with presidential appointments, or the legislative branch can impeach the president. They can also impeach a federal judge or a justice of the Supreme Court if they do something really wrong. Keywords of the executive branch I want you to write down are going to be session, appoint, and veto, because these are kind of the things that the president is allowed to do. He also administers the federal bureaucracy, but again, we'll talk about that later when we get to the executive branch. To me, one of the easiest ones is the judicial branch, because the judicial branch, I really only want you to think of three words: unconstitutional, constitutional, and judicial review. Now, on the notes, I just wrote constitutional because it's so similar to constitutional, but those are the ones I want you to know. Moving on. And this slide right here is what I'm going to end on, and you can just hit pause when I'm finished. But it shows all the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances put together. Okay. First we have the legislative branch, then we have the judicial branch, and then we have the executive branch. Now, when we get into our second part of this lecture, we're going to actually talk about all these different things each branch do. But now I want you to pause and read through the different jobs of the branches, which are located in the blue boxes. Thank you, guys, and I'll see you next time.